All right. Let me sure. There. So, let's go to the page on Canvas. Let's go to home. So you've got that second homework. Just gonna do next week. What a week from today. So hopefully you started kind of working on that, chipping away at it. If you have any questions, I'll let you know. Gotten getting this hand in my stats courses this week, so my office hours will probably be busy the next 2 days. But if you want to stop by, I've got office hours 2 to 4 today and tomorrow. If there's another time that works for you, let me know. Otherwise, kind of early next week, shouldn't have as many other people to compete with. But still feel free to stop by. I'm just letting you know it might be a little bit of a wait there. Okay. Any questions for me? Anything class related before we jump into material here? All right, so I might try to keep today's class a little shorter. I know we got a lot of people out from probably the job fair. But we'll kind of transition a little bit away, and I rearrange the slides and put them back up on Canvas because I want to go through things in a little bit different order. We'll talk today about facility costs, right? So we'll think a little bit about why did teams build these new facilities, despite some of them exceeding like SoFi like $1 billion. Right? I mean, there's this wild price tags associated with these facilities. So why do you think that teams want new facilities? What do they probably believe that would do? Yeah.
Increased revenue.
Yeah, why would it increase revenue? If I can provide an experience that fans have a higher marginal benefit, right? The facilities are nicer, there's more concessions, all X, Y, Z. Well, then I've increased their marginal benefit, increased the demand curve for my product, increasing my marginal revenue. So it must be that they believe that there's going to be a shift in demand, and a good shift, right? In fact, we kind of talked about this a little bit before, but why might some teams not want to build a new stadium? Like, for example, Wrigley Field. They might believe if they build an entirely new stadium, that might actually decrease demand for these historic kind of stadiums. Right? And so the ones that we see being built that are new must mean that they believe the demand is going to increase, right? That would have to justify this huge increase in additional costs, right? Excuse me. So just some of the price tags, just to kind of get an idea. Like I was trying, and these are like the reported amounts. I don't know exactly how accurate these are. You're kind of believing the teams. But you're talking about billions of, over $1 billion for NFL stadiums, even for NBA stadiums. Brooklyn's was cost $1 billion. Some of the NHL stadiums maybe a little bit less, but these are really, really expensive. So they must believe that it's shifting that demand curve. Right? So the benefits we can kind of think about. Hopefully, we're going to see a boost in attendance because of this increase in marginal benefit. So I'm getting increased ticket revenue, right? And what we see play out is there's what is called a honeymoon effect, and we'll talk about it a little bit today, but the paper that we're going to read for Friday also kind of gets at this idea that the first year or two, first couple years after this new stadium is built, when we just look at attendance, right, it does look like that attendance increases, right? And so even if we, account for the fact that like the stadiums are different sizes, we still see that there's an increase in attendance or an increase in kind of the ticket prices, right? If we are kind of capped or we're hitting our capacity. So after the first couple of years, though, it looks like by, I think if I remember right from the one study, it's like year 3 or something. It says I've put a few years here. I think it's year 3. It already goes to having no effect, right? So you get an initial bump in demand, right? But then it looks like it kind of goes back to having no effect on attendance, right? So we'll kind of call this our honeymoon effect, right? It's a small positive effect that is declining over time, right? Once the stadium is 3 or 4 years old, it's not, we don't see demand be any different from 3 or 4 years prior. Okay. So why might we not see as much of an effect in the NFL if we're strictly looking at attendance? Compared to the other leagues, what do you think might be more true about some of these NFL?
Less games, so there's more.
Less games, higher demand, which probably means it's more likely that they're hitting the capacity, right? And so, yeah, building a new stadium, even if I assume I build the same number of seats, even if I see an increase in demand, if I'm just looking at attendance, I'm not going to see any change in attendance, right? Kind of a reminder of that. Just real quick, we'll kind of think about that ticket market. If I'm a team and I've got relatively high demand to begin with, And here we could draw in marginal revenue and they treat like a monopolist for the sake of this example. We'll just use a demand curve, not to make it more things going on than we really need. Say they build this new stadium, keep the capacity exactly the same, right? Whatever it was before, they're building a new stadium. It's got all their amenities, but the exact same number of seats, right? Or the exact same kind of capacity. Well, notice if I'm just looking at attendance, the quantity of tickets sold isn't going to change at all, right? So we think about this as the quantity of tickets and price. So for NFL, if I wanted to know, is there this kind of honeymoon effect? Do I see an increase initially in demand when they build a new stadium? I probably less likely I want to look at attendance values, and probably a little more likely I want to take a look at ticket prices, right? Ticket price data is much more difficult to get. I'm sure you could do a web scraping of like StubHub or something and get an idea about what some of these tickets are going for. But I haven't seen anybody use kind of involve pricing data. Typically, they're looking at kind of attendance measures. And there, we probably wouldn't want to target the NFL if we're asking that question. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? And then, like I said, you could add in marginal revenue curves as well and treat like a monopolist, and the same thing would play out. If demand was already high enough to be selling out, if our new stadium has the same number of seats as before, even if we see an increase in demand, we may not see that in the attendance data. We'd only see it in pricing data. Okay. All right. So we just don't have as much room for growth there. Right? And we've already talked about the greater attendance would be greater marginal revenue. So another thing I would kind of point out here with thinking about hitting capacity is anytime we want to measure something and we're looking at attendance, we probably don't want to see, has there been, what might be a better measure of just simply looking at the number of people is looking at the percent of the stadium that was filled, right? So instead of kind of looking at, just pure attendance measures, a lot of times what we'll see is they can convert attendance data to capacity, right? Percent of the capacity that was met. So instead of 30,000 people, it would be, well, if it was a 60,000 person stadium, it's only 0.5, right? I was only hitting half capacity. Right? So we'll say that in some of the papers that we look at and kind of discuss that they often kind of scale that attendance measure. So we already talked about why we don't see a boost in attendance in terms of if we hit capacity, but there's other reasons as well, right? So let's say we don't see this boost in attendance even after we build this new stadium. Well, why? Performance still matters, right? So there's all these other things that are factoring in, right, to that demand curve. And yeah, you may, with building a new stadium, see an increase in demand, right? But if your team, right, the whole reason you were building a new stadium is because you thought it would bring in more people because your team was doing really poorly and you weren't bringing in a lot of people, well, then that trend might continue, right? And so that trend of kind of quality decline would overshadow any increase that we would expect to see in demand from building this new stadium, right? So new stadiums aren't going to, fix my quality issues, right? So it may be that these teams who are building these new facilities were the ones who were doing poor, right? Another way to think about this in this attendance or this ticket market, we'll use the exact same setup. So let's say they build a new stadium, right? Even if this team was selling at capacity, right, but the price is relatively low. Let's say they build a new stadium, same capacity, they see a boost in demand. But the problem is every year their demand curve also is a function of team quality. Well, if the team in that year after the move is even lower quality because they spent money on the new facility, not as much on player salaries, I'm drawing this extreme to make a point, you could end up with first an increase in demand from having a new facility, but then a decrease in demand because my team quality is going down, right? I was doing poor before. That's the whole reason I built the facility, but that trend continued, right? My quality was still declining year after year. And now it might have even been exacerbated by the fact that I had to spend all this money on my stadium. I might have less money for player salaries, right? Any questions on that? This isn't showing up as green for some reason on here, so I'll try to use different colors moving forward here. Okay with that? So, kind of interesting example of this is when the Yankees, I guess they didn't technically build a new stadium, but they renovated, like basically rebuilt the stadium, spent over $1 billion on it, and they actually saw attendance decline. So why might we have seen attendance decline, but we saw revenues go up by 100 million? This gets at that same idea that when we're thinking about the ticket market, we have to be cautious when we're thinking about the quantity of tickets sold or attendance. So what was probably true about the Yankees' new stadium if attendance went down, but they saw an increase in revenues? Prices went up. Same thing we were talking about before, right? So the prices went up, but also, and in conjunction with that, prices also went up because they actually had fewer seats, right? They were selling out a lot of games prior to the renovations. After the renovations, they still sold out a lot of games, right? So we didn't, and then we reduced the size of the stadium. So if we hit capacity, we're seeing a fewer number of tickets sold, which is why maybe the percent of the capacity would have been a better measure, right? But if we see that because we built a smaller stadium, attendance is going to be a little bit lower, but it's also going to increase prices, right? And especially if we have this demand increase from having a new stadium as well. Why would lower attendance may not necessarily mean lower revenue, right? So let's say I build a new stadium and it is smaller, right? So we could think about if I had a scenario where we'll kind of think about if they're acting like a monopolist here. So I'll just draw in my demand, marginal revenue curves, right? Let's say, I should have drawn here. I'm going to draw these a little bit more sharp so I leave myself some more room. Quantity of tickets. I want my demand curve to look like that. There we go. So my demand, marginal revenue curve. Let's say capacity was initially right here. I'm making my price. I set as a monopolist somewhere here. Okay. Well, if I build a new stadium, even if there's no changes in demand, right? Even if I build a new stadium, I could actually increase revenues. If I built a slightly smaller stadium, I'm still able to sell it out and I can get a higher price, right? So what would have to be true, because total revenue is price times quantity. Well, here building this new stadium, I saw a reduction in quantity, but my price went up. So it matters the relative size of those. So I won't go through any examples to make you calculate this, but what's a good measure to know? If I built this smaller stadium and I can now kind of charge higher prices, does that increase in the price I can charge overcompensate for this reduction in quantity? What's something I would want to look at about my demand curve? This is something that I know you calculated in your 201 courses, but elasticities, right? So your percent change in quantity demanded, if that's smaller than the percentage change in price, we would actually see total revenues go up, right? Now, like I said, I'm not going to kind of get into the elasticities for this class, but just relating it to that idea, that's how we could potentially see an increase in total revenues, even if we reduce the size of our stadium and there was even no change in demand. Right? If we see a change in demand, well, that's just going to increase the price even more, making it even more likely that moving to this smaller stadium is going to result in higher total revenue. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? So this is like the most extreme, like no change in demand. Even then, we could still see an increase in total revenues for building a smaller stadium. So that's basically operating through higher ticket prices. Now, what we could also do is not just play with capacity, but I think it's on this slide. If not, I'm jumping the gun. Yeah, there we go. I might also don't want to just look at pure attendance numbers. It'd be better if I can't often get data on this, but it'd be better to know like, okay, yeah, I sold more tickets, but different tickets have a different value, right? Luxury suite tickets are going to have a much higher additional revenue that they add to the team than kind of selling your upper deck tickets, right? Way up in the nose. So if we look at kind of across time, this is just, I didn't try to cherry pick these. I tried to look at some of these new stadiums we built. We can kind of see the number of suites over time has been increasing. In fact, like Jerry Jones down there at AT&T, they have the most suites, right? Now here, more recently, they've even delineated their product even more. It's not just luxury box tickets. They realize If we limit the supply of suites, we can charge a lot of money for those, then also create kind of like this additional like upgrade, you know, a higher quality experience of the game kind of with these club seats. So it's kind of hard. We're not just going to compare attendance numbers. If we really had the data, it would be ideal to compare attendance for general tickets, attendance for club seats, attendance for suites. And then we know that those different products will command different prices, right? So if we build a new stadium and we know that, you know, if I increase the number of luxury boxes or luxury suites that I have, demand for those is relatively high, then maybe I see an increase in total revenue, even though I saw a reduction in attendance because maybe, you know, these suites are going to replace, like, if I didn't have suites and I instead had regular seating, maybe it'd be like, I don't know, 500 tickets I could sell. Well, making them luxury suites, right? It's not all, you know, it's filled with chairs, whatever you want to call it, bleachers. And so, yeah, maybe I see a reduction in attendance, but I actually see an increase in revenue because I can charge a lot more money for those luxury suites. Does that idea make sense? I shouldn't be too crazy there. So here, I'll kind of put up this idea. So the next thing we'll think about is what is the benefit to the fans, right? So it's kind of hard to estimate, right? So like all these things, you know, list the amenities that they're kind of adding in, practical roofs, beer gardens, which they go on this side. How many of you guys have been to Lucas Oil when it had it open? It is like the best idea. I don't understand why every stadium doesn't do that. Like it is perfect for like early fall games. Like it's like the best experience ever. But anyways, so they add in all these amenities, things that I think people will like me. I would now be way more likely to go to Lucas Oil. I don't even like the Colts, but I'd be much more likely to watch a game there because I know, like, man, if you're there on the first week of September or whatever, this is awesome, right? So they're increasing their marginal benefit by adding these amenities, but it's possible that we could still see consumer surplus reduce, right? So because that size of the stadiums is typically, if we're looking at time, the number of tickets has been decreasing, it is possible that we could get a reduction in consumer surplus. So even though they're having a higher marginal benefit for those who are attending, there's going to be some people who might be cut out of this market. So I'll try to give you an idea what that looks like here. Well, actually, yeah, we'll use this right here. So before, consumer surplus would have been what? The area underneath my demand curve, but above the price I was paying. So this entire area was consumer surplus. What's consumer surplus afterwards? And this is where I'm using different colors, so hopefully it comes out. What's the area underneath my demand curve, but above the new price? Well, notice consumer surplus has decreased considerably, right? So these new stadiums, the people who attend the games, yeah, they're still benefiting, right? But there's also now a lot of people who aren't attending the games, right? And even though I'm benefiting more from attending, I'm also being charged a higher price, right? So we could actually see consumer surplus be reduced if typically these new stadiums that are being built are lower in capacity. You want to think about it that way. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? So we want to start to be able to think about things like where consumer and producer surplus are. I think we've kind of reviewed a little bit, but remember, consumer surplus is the area between my demand curve and the price. Think about this differently, between individuals' marginal benefits and the price they pay. Well, what's the price they pay for them? It's really just the difference between the consumer's marginal benefit and the consumer's marginal cost. The marginal cost is the price, and the demand curve reflects our marginal benefits, right? If we instead wanted to think about producer surplus, well, that would be the area, it's kind of weird with the ticket market, but underneath the price and above my supply curve. Well, here in the ticket market, my supply curve is this horizontal and vertical line. So it's really everything underneath the price down to my supply curve. Right? Another way of thinking about this, well, the price is their marginal cost, right? Or sorry, not what I wanted. The supply curve represents their marginal cost, and the price to them is really the marginal benefit, right? That's what they're keeping. So when we're measuring surplus, we're really measuring the same thing, right? All it is the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of whatever person you're looking at. Now, for consumers, that difference is going to be the area between the price they pay and the demand curve. For producers, it's going to be the area between the price they receive and the supply curve. Okay. But we're really looking at the same thing, right? What's the net benefit to both of these parties? Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Let me think. So is there anything else I want to say here? We've already talked about the surplus. I think we're good. I've talked about this in the past, so we'll kind of go through this quick, and I guess something else I want to address today in a little more detail. But we used to see teams share stadiums, right? And even currently, we're still seeing a lot of teams decide to build stadiums and share them. So you've got New York teams, you've got the LA teams. In football, not aware of any teams that share a baseball stadium. But then there's also NBA teams that they don't share stadiums necessarily with other NBA teams, but they'll share with hockey teams, right? So it can be cross-sport kind of sharing as well. We said that makes more sense in basketball and hockey because you have a similar playing field, right? Doesn't make as much sense for baseball, football, which is why we've kind of seen a lot of teams. Really, I don't think there's any team that still shares stadium with baseball and football. But there used to be some that moved away from that because they realized the field of play is so different that, yeah, even though I'll have to pay some additional cost to build my own stadium, the additional revenue that's gained from having a stadium that's fit for this specific sport more than compensates for that. Right? So we see this play out, right? Why would they do that? You're basically cutting your costs in half, right? If you're sharing with another team. So I think like I said, we talked about this a little bit in the past, but here's kind of more of a summary of that. So we typically see things that might have a similar playing field be more likely to share stadiums because then there's no loss. There's no loss in revenue from not having a stadium that fits your field, right? Because they're very similar, right? But the issue would be if you have kind of two playing fields that aren't the same. Well, then you're going to have some losses associated with sharing the stadium. Yeah, you save some money on the costs, but it's a question of which of those is larger. Do I want to say anything about this? I kind of want to skip ahead real quick. So we'll come back to this Friday because this is a little bit more related to what we're going to do then. So yeah, this is what I wanted to do. It's okay. We're talking a little bit about kind of what's happening when they build a new stadium for the teams, also for the individuals purchasing tickets. But what about the people in the city, right? So we're going to start thinking about some externalities, okay? So if we think about a new stadium being built in a city, can we actually consider it a public good? Well, it's not a public good in the sense like it's not right. I mean, for it to be a public good, it has to be non-rival and non-excludable, right? Because it's neither of those things. But we can think of it as a public good in the sense of, so that's if you're thinking about it just attending the game, right? But you can enjoy the benefits of having a stadium in your city. What happens if a new stadium locates in your city? Well, around it, what's most likely to pop up? Restaurants, bars, bringing additional people, hotels, bringing additional jobs. So all the benefits of having that stadium in your city, those are non-rival, non-excludable. Like once it's there, everybody in the city gets to enjoy all the additional things that pop up around, right? So we can't think of it as a public good in the sense of not the people attending the game, but for anyone who lives in that city, right? So we can think about it being, tickets aren't a public good, but we can't think about like people in the city. And even if you want to make it as simple as this, like what if no restaurants or bars? There is some value. There is some marginal benefit. I think people would say if you're in a city, you kind of have some level of fandom, right? Like that's your local team. You identify with that team a little bit more. You hear people, that's why people get so heated in like Philly, Baltimore games, right? Like they're very tied to that. There's some value to that, right? So, so even if we, assume that no new infrastructure, no new businesses will come into the area, there's still going to be somewhat of a public good to the people that live in that city from having a team located in that city. Other benefits, maybe there's some economic gains to the city, like I mentioned, right? New restaurants, new bars, they pay taxes, they bring in more people. So we think there could be some additional benefits to the city, or positive externalities, right? The people involved in attending the game, right? The people putting the games on, people buying tickets, yeah, they're going to have their own costs and benefits. But now we're thinking about there's additional benefits to people who aren't even attending the game, just the people living in the city, right? So what's that going to look like? So I kind of have an externality review here. I've got negative and positive. Since we already have a positive one, we'll start with that. So I left the slides kind of blank for a reason. So kind of a review, and then we'll maybe add some things that won't be review into it. I can get this here. So we're thinking about, in general, right, just the price quantity combination. And we've got some demand curve, which reflects private marginal benefits, and a supply curve, which reflects the private marginal costs. Right? If we have a positive externality, then what we're thinking about is, okay, there are private marginal benefits, and then there's what we'll call marginal social benefits, right? How much society is marginally benefiting from having a different quantity of whatever product we're looking at. Here, the example we'll eventually get to is the quantity of games. Now, it's a little bit different because we don't have, we might have like a vertical supply curve, but we'll kind of keep it general for right now. So my marginal social benefit will be whatever the consumer's benefit is, plus this external benefit to anybody else just living in the city, not even involved in this ticket market, right? Not even involved in purchasing tickets, right? Or not even involved in attending the games, however you want to think about this. So my marginal social benefit is my old demand curve, essentially, plus some additional amount at any quantity. I'm going to see that the marginal social benefit is higher, right? Or I can think about it as like a shift in demand. Or it's not really, demand isn't shifting, but it's demand plus some additional benefit. So where would society like the equilibrium to be? So we'll call this kind of society's price and quantity. And where would the free market kind of arrive at? So we'll call this perfectly competitive, right? So what we can see here is that if we have some positive externalities, what is true about the quantity that the private market will choose? It'll be less than society's optimum point, right? So what might we want to do, right? Well, we want to incentivize there to be, so maybe it's like the number of games played in the city, right? Or the number of teams even in the city. You could model it that way, where at some point, if the marginal social benefits are high enough to having, 2 teams in the area, maybe I see 2 teams, right? We might want 2 teams, but the free market, right, just kind of arrives at 1. But for society, it'd be better off if we could get additional teams, get additional games played. So one thing when you think about how can we incentivize teams to build a stadium in my area? That was something that cities do, and we'll get at this a little bit more probably next week. But if I know the quantity of teams is too low, and this could be as weird as like 0-1. The private market might arrive at 0, but the city would really benefit. We should have at least 1 team here. How could I maybe incentivize a team to come to my city? So I'm not sure how much this gets into the media, so I'm not super surprised nobody knows, but usually I got like 1 person. So when they build a stadium in these areas, what a lot of these cities will do is they offer a proposed bond, right? That they will tax their citizens a certain amount, and that money is going to go to helping the team finance the stadium, right? So the cities themselves actually help support the purchase of these stadiums. So what are they really doing to the teams? They're giving them subsidy, right? Which is how we fix this issue. If I arrive at a quantity that's too low, well, what I'm going to do is just use a subsidy, hopefully get it as close as I can to whatever the external benefit is, which would then push my demand curve up to matching that marginal social benefit curve, right? So anytime I have positive externalities, we know that we want to offer subsidies what does this look like in the context of these stadiums, these or really, it doesn't have to be just like a sporting stadium. You can think about like, there could be subsidies for, what would you like, an amphitheater, like whatever it is. What was it, Roche now? I don't know. They change it every 5 years. So yeah, roof. Yeah. Like a mortgage company. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. I don't know. I don't want to do all these facts, but you know, anything that you would want to be like in your city. The other one that's wild, you can think about, it's very similar, is and if you get the opportunity to do this, I strongly suggest it. But the Colts do their practice for like their practice field that they were doing. This last year was the Lions and the Colts had kind of a shared practice. So this complex that's out there, I think Indy 11, the soccer team practices out there. Like, it is this enormous complex. They've got, I'm sure, all kinds of AAU, like stuff like that.
You're talking about Rampart in Westfield?
Yeah. Whatever they use for their practice field. I don't remember the name, but it's wild. And what they did was that city, I actually got interested because once I was there, I was like, well, how much did this cost? Like, I mean, it's acres and acres. And like, so I looked into it and I forget the amount. It was ridiculous millions. Like, you're just like, this is wild. But what's interesting is that area actually did give a proposal to the company that was going to come in. It wasn't the city itself, but they did subsidize the building of that facility. Why? Because they know as soon as that's there, and you're going to have who knows how many AAU teams for basketball, volleyball, whatever playing in that area, guess what's going to start popping up all around it? Tons of restaurants, tons of bars, tons of things that people are going to want to do right after, even places to like shop, because like as long as you're there, if you can bring in other things. So it's been a huge boost for that city's economy, right? Or that local, I don't know, it wouldn't be a township or so, whatever it is, you know, whatever the municipality is. So we see this happen all the time. It could be something like new stadiums, but we can also put this in the context of just any event space, right? And so that would make sense, right? We can kind of push back out to this socially optimal point. Right? It's socially optimal for, was it Westfield? Mm-hmm. Westfield to have this one, to move the quantity from 0 to 1, right? But it was too costly. And up until they offered a subsidy, there was no company that found it profitable to do so. Right. Questions on this before I get going here? I know it was a bit of an aside, but I thought that was a new one. So we've got these positive externalities that could exist. So some of the things that people have looked at, just a general example, if we think about getting education, if we don't provide subsidies, often we might have an undereducated population. We won't get to that socially efficient quantity. So what do? We authorize subsidized loans. We authorize, federal Pell Grants, things like that. But in the concept like our sport example, a lot of times we think about the positive externalities are going to be the people in the city from new businesses, hotels, potentially that brings in new jobs, right? Increase kind of wages in the area. And so there's a lot of studies that try to look at what's the impact of having a major or a new stadium in your area. So we'll come back to negative externalities in a second here. But because I'm talking about this, I want to kind of get to where what some of the research says, right? So we might see some of these new local businesses, we might see new jobs, but what we actually see when we look at the data is that it doesn't look like there's really any strong effect of these major league stadiums being in a city, right? So why might this be the case? So before I put this, so we don't see it in the data. There's a bunch of different studies that have looked at this. They've looked at the NBA, NFL, MLB. I don't know about NHL. Might be more interesting to look at them, and we'll talk why in a second. But why might it not boost the kind of income, number of jobs, things like that in the city?
Because you're foregoing like all the land in the area.
Yeah, it's where are you foregoing to have this new stadium? Well, what could have been there instead? I don't know, some big art museum that could have generated might have brought in just as many local restaurants, just as many local bars. It could have had a huge concert arena. Could have brought in just as many new number of jobs, new restaurants, new bars, new hotels, all this stuff. And so you have to think about for these really large cities, yeah, maybe we don't see an increase in revenue because that revenue would have been made from some other leisure activity. Might not have been from professional baseball, but it might have been from, I don't know, Taylor Swift playing a concert there, right? And so we have to think about these large cities. It's really what's the benefit is going to be the difference between having that stadium and the next best option, right? Well, if our next best option is almost the same additional revenue or almost the same additional increase in the number of jobs to the city, there really is no marginal benefit to adding that stadium, right? Because going from not having a stadium or you have this other event space to having a stadium, if there's no difference, my marginal benefit to building it is zero. Now, that would mean that where might new stadiums actually have a stronger suburbs, right? Or you're kind of getting at the idea that maybe smaller communities, right? So that's why another reason why you see a lot of more of these new stadiums being built in the suburbs. Well, first of all, there's a lot of reasons. So like land costs are lower, but you can also imagine like for the city or for the city or the township themselves, they benefit a lot more. So the paper that we'll look at on Friday, just kind of anticipating a little bit, is actually going to be looking at minor league stadiums, right? And we'll kind of talk about the interesting effects that paper finds there. But I've never seen anyone do this, but I always thought a really good paper would be to look at these effects of new stadiums. The problem is you just might not have enough of them, right? But to kind of differentiate it between small and large markets, or just use population of the metro to kind of say, does that stadium appear to have a difference, make a difference for large market teams? We would expect maybe not, because they could have just replaced it with something else. But maybe for these smaller market teams, they can't attract, all these other additional amenities that would have replaced a sporting stadium. And so maybe they actually see a benefit, even though the large market teams don't. When you look over at a whole, kind of get the average effect, it looks like it's zero. Okay. Questions on this before we keep moving? This is just the general idea. We'll go back today just for the sake of this example, because we'll kind of do some more stuff with this next class. You could also argue, there we go. So you could also argue that maybe building these new stadiums, maybe there's some negative externalities as well, right? Excuse me. So I can think of kind of the main one. I think it's just the easiest one to think about is if I build a new stadium, like let's say, it's already pretty good, but let's say it's Arlington Heights where they're thinking about building the very new stadium. Let's say they get that stadium. What do you think probably happens around that area? What becomes probably a lot more unmanageable? Traffic, right? So there are like very real negative externalities from having this stadium as well, right? Now we'll look on, we might get there today, but if not, we'll look on Friday at this paper that kind of looked at, okay, well, the traffic, if that's a major negative externality, you would expect that around the stadium, but not as far when you get further out, right? So here, if we think about just any general market, this could be for the number of games, number of teams, number of stadiums, however we want to model this. The free market might arrive, I guess I should call this perfectly competitive, price and quantity. If we've got a negative externality, right, then essentially, I forgot to write this in, we can think of this as representing marginal benefit, this is representing marginal costs, right? And then think about, okay, what would my marginal social cost be? Well, that's just my supply curve or marginal cost of the private producers in this industry. But plus, there's now this additional cost or loss of time due to traffic, right? Or you could argue some of these areas, maybe an increase in domestic disturbance or whatever, like public intox, things like that, right? So maybe there are these negative externalities. So we would essentially think about, okay, our supply curve at every single point, it's our old supply curve plus some additional cost. So we have this marginal social cost curve that kind of lets us know the quantity is actually too high from what the city would like, right? So in both scenarios, we kind of have that the price that the city would like to charge is going to be higher, right? If we kind of think about, let's say we had both positive and negative externalities. Well, we could draw these on the same graph, but then it would matter like, well, how much did I shift each one? What was the actual external cost? What was the actual external benefit? Because notice both of them, the price was too low, right? The price the market arrived at was lower than what society wanted. So we know if we have negative and positive externalities that exist from building this new stadium, which we likely will, right? There's going to be increased traffic. There's going to be increased public intox. There's going to also be increased restaurants, hotels, whatever. So we looked at the negative externality. That's going to mean that we arrive at a quantity that's too high. Well, if there's positive externalities, we'll arrive at a quantity that's too low. So what's going to be true about the quantity that the market arrives at relative to what society would want? We can't say, right? If we have these simultaneous effects going on, instead of drawing all at one time, we would do it just like we saw when we had shifts in supply and demand, right? So here, I can kind of think about it as my positive externality meant that the quantity was too low. My negative externality said the quantity was too high. So what's the total effect if I have both of these things happening? I can't say. I need to know the actual, I need to know the actual size of that external cost and that external benefit, or the shifts in both of those. Okay. If the positive externality or the external benefit is larger, well, then I know that's the thing that's going to win out, right? And vice versa, right? If I know that the negative externality, the external cost is greater, well, then I know that the quantity is going to be too high, right? That's it. Any questions on this idea? It's not going through it, drawing them both in the same, because, this becomes the problem where I could draw a one-way, showing a really large shift in my marginal social benefit or a really large positive externality that would look like this wins out, or I could draw a really large shift from my negative externality and then that would win out. So it's really a matter of look at the effects of each individual change, the positive and the negative externality, and then if they both kind of predict that the price is going to be too low from what society would want, well, then you know that the price is going to be too low. But if they suggest different things about the quantities, well, then you have to kind of write that out separately and then kind of say, well, it's indeterminate. I would need to know the size. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Let me think what else I want to say if there's anything. Yeah, so I kind of said congestion. Like I said, public intox is another real one you can kind of think about. So that probably does pretty well for us. I'll kind of skip ahead a little bit. Just to kind of note some of the studies. So we'll talk about this paper actually on Friday, which is that minor league baseball stadiums appear to have somewhat of an effect on per capita income in that area. All the studies that have been kind of been done at the professional level really find no change in either income or even the number of jobs. Relative, right? So they do some really cool things where like they compare them to otherwise identical cities. So like they match cities based off of population, income, demographics. One where there's a city that doesn't have a stadium, one that does, and they kind of compare the differences there and they find there's really no difference, right? And it could be because once I'm looking at like, what's the effect of having a new NFL stadium? Well, it could be that there's a city that has an NFL team that doesn't have a baseball team, and there could be another city that has a baseball team but not a football team, right? So it's not so much that there's no benefit to having a stadium, it's that there's no benefit to having a specific sports stadium, because if I didn't have an NFL team in this city, maybe I'd have a baseball team, and they would bring in both the additional, the positive externalities that exist from both of them would be about the same. So it really looks like there's no impact there. Whereas maybe in these minor league cities, like South Bend, Gary, Toledo, like maybe there's not likely going to be a professional team or another team that kind of steps in and takes the place of those minor league teams. So they actually do bring in some additional positive externalities of revenue to the area. And then it was kind of a cool one, and I'll bring this in Friday if we have time to look at it, because it's kind of an interesting paper where it's looking at real estate prices. So this is like the only one I've seen that has used this, but thinking about positive externalities that exist, they're looking at Columbus, around Ohio State, and around their football field, and looking at what happened to real estate prices, like when they from having the stadium, and that the distance from the facility actually impacts that real estate price. So it's kind of interesting to think about, these positive externalities are likely going to be pretty concentrated to the individuals living around a stadium. But what's also interesting is that's also going to be where the highest negative externalities exist as well, right? So we'll take a look at a couple other papers on Friday. I'll kind of let you guys get out of here a little bit early today. If you have any questions on that homework, like I said, feel free to reach out. Other than that, I am working on those data sets, so I'll start getting a lot more of those sent out probably this afternoon and tomorrow. Okay. All right. We'll see you guys on Friday.
Has there been any research on, I know like a few years ago, they cut a ton of minor league teams for Major League Baseball.
Yeah. So I